The interesting thing, I suppose, about Bible prophecy, as we've seen in our studies, is that once we have a framework, it's surprising how everything now in the matter of Bible prophecy will fit somewhere on that framework. Not only does it belong to the red line or to the blue line, but is it the first phase or the second phase? Was it a prophecy that was fulfilled in the first half before our Lord Jesus Christ came, and for which there is no secondary fulfillment? Or is there good biblical evidence in the passage itself that there might be a second fulfillment, a latter-day fulfillment at the time of the end? And somehow you'll be able to take many Bible prophecies now and find where they might fit on that particular framework. So we're looking at developments in Europe today and the revival of the beast system. So would that be the red line or the blue line? And the answer, of course, has got to be the red line, isn't it? This is part of the system of the seed of the serpent that will oppose the seed of the woman at the time of the end. And the developments that we're looking at here are part of the development of that serpent power before our Lord Jesus Christ returns. So if you come to Genesis chapter 10, we have some interesting information concerning the sons of Japheth, since that's part of our title. How have the sons of Japheth managed to revive the beast? Well, our story starts this morning in Genesis chapter 10, where it says in verse 1, "Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were sons born after the flood. The sons of Japheth, Gomer, and Magog, and Madai, and Javan, and Tubal, and Meshech, and Tiras. And the sons of Gomer, Ashkenaz, and Riphath, and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan, Elisha, and Tarshish, Kittim, and Dedanim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations." So here we're given now the generations of the sons of Japheth in their dispersion, as verse 2 says. And you'll notice that the stock of Japheth were those known for their exploratory zeal. These are they who would divide the isles of the Gentiles and populate them, as verse 5 says. Of course, the sons of Japheth were the Indo-European races, and from them would come those leading explorers of the world that would migrate all over the place. And in fact, they migrated, of course, from where the story first began, because the sons of Noah were going to migrate, of course, from where the ark first came to rest. And from where the ark came to rest in Ararat, the sons of Japheth would now advance into other regions. And in fact, of all the sons of Japheth, there are two in particular who we believe migrated the furthest of all. Now, Josephus says, concerning the migration of the sons of Japheth, he says this. Josephus says in his book Antiquities, book 1 and chapter 6, he says, "Japheth, the son of Noah, had 7 sons. And beginning at the mountains Taurus and Amanus, they proceeded along Asia as far as the river Tanai, which is the river Don." So you'll notice that the river Don there is in the heartland of what we would call modern Russia today, but heading in fact eastwards. And the sons of Japheth headed in that direction as far as that river and then up along that river. But Josephus says they also proceeded along Europe to Cadiz, which is just beyond the Straits of Gibraltar. And Josephus goes on to say that Gomer founded those whom the Greeks now call Galatai, but who were then called Gomerites, and Magog founded those that from him were formed or named Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called the Scythii. And Herodotus takes up that word Scythii, and he says, he says the Scythii, the Magogites, well, he says that was a name given by the Greeks to an ancient and widely extended people of Europe who had spread themselves from the river Don, but westwards along the banks of the Danube. So the Scythii, the Magogites, one of the sons of Japheth, had spread along the Danube in a westerly direction now, traveling across Europe. And finally, Diodorus Siculus says that Scythia was above Gaul, extending to the Baltic and describing that large tract of land above the Rhine. So if we were to look at those names, what we would find is that those three historical writers tell us that the sons of Japheth migrated firstly up the River Don, then along into the area of Europe here, traveling along the Danube, and traveling in fact as west as the Iberian Peninsula itself of Spain and Portugal. And in particular, Gomer and Magog were above one another or contiguous to one another, separated by the River Rhine. Gomer was to the south and Magog was to the north of that geographical divide. And that's interesting because it's these two sons in particular that we want to look at this morning. And by the way, which of those two sons were they? Well, they're the first two, the oldest two boys. The sons of Japheth, says verse 2, Gomer and Magog. So here's the oldest sons of Japheth now, who migrated perhaps the most westerly, right to the far side of Europe. And in fact, if we were to look at the other names of the sons in Genesis chapter 10, verse 2, when it mentions Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal, let's see if we can just pinpoint, in fact, where each of those sons came to, because in their dispersion, it looks something like this. So Gomer was in the area of what we would describe as modern France and the Iberian Peninsula. But to the north of that, separated, remember, by the Rhine River, was the power of the second son of Japheth, known as Magog. Now, do you notice how that in Genesis 10, the third son is called Madai? Now, that word Madai in Genesis 10 is the same word translated media in other parts of the Old Testament. And of course, media is the word for the Medes and the Persians, and answers to the modern territory of Iran. So the Medians, or the Madai, actually were in the area of modern Iran today. And then it says we've got Javan. And Javan, of course, is the word from whence the Ionian Peninsula has derived its name, answering to the area of Greece and the islands around. When it mentions Tubal, we believe that Tubal was to the north. Meshech, by the way, began a little lower than that, down between the Black and Caspian seas, but Meshech migrated northwards. And the last son, the son mentioned as Taras in Genesis chapter 10, is actually the ancient area of Thracia, answering to the territories of Romania and Bulgaria and around the area of the Black Sea. In fact, it's been suggested that Taras, the ras at the end of Taras, is the beginning of the word Rus, who would become the Russians or the Rossi, who also migrated from that Black Sea area northwards into what would now become eventually modern Ukraine. So if we were to say, well, where did the sons of Japheth go? The answer is, well, the sons of Japheth populated the European landmass, didn't they? That's where they went. The sons of Japheth basically populated Europe. Well, that brings us to our next Bible passage, which is Daniel chapter 7. And you'll remember the story of the beasts of Daniel 7, which in turn, of course, follow the story of Daniel chapter 2 in terms of the metals of the empire. Of course, the interesting thing, isn't it, brothers and sisters, about the two visions of Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 is that Daniel 2 is Nebuchadnezzar's view or version of the kingdom of men. He sees it as a mighty great warrior, whereas Daniel 7 is the divine estimate of those same nations as given by dream to Daniel, and God sees those same powers as nothing other than wild beasts, following one after the other. Now, you'll remember what Daniel 7 says. Verse 4 of Daniel 7 says, the first was like a lion, and we know that that answers to the Babylonian kingdom. The second, verse 5, the second beast like a bear, which answers to the Medo-Persian, or should I say Babylon-Medo-Persian. The third, verse 6, like a leopard, answering to the Grecian or the Babylon-Grecian, and then in the night visions of verse 7, a fourth and terrible beast, which probably was a dragon of some sort, perhaps even a crocodile. But let's just match that up now with Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. Now, I'm going to cover myself here, brothers and sisters, and say that this particular slide was, of course, prepared as a public lecture for interested friends, and therefore we revert to the correct historical names of these places, even though I've omitted the word Babylon at the front of them all. So we've got Babylon, and then, of course, the head of gold becomes the lion, doesn't it, which eventually stands upright on its feet. And then we've got Medo-Persia, which becomes the bear. And then we've got Greece, which becomes the leopard. And then we've got the legs of iron, which becomes the Roman Empire and the fourth beast. And finally, we've got the 10 horns, subdued by the little horn, answering to the divided kingdoms. Now, what's interesting about Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 is where those beasts lived. Where did those beasts live, brothers and sisters? Well, let me show you where they lived if we have a look at that from the perspective of their geographical setting. And what we'll find is that as we come through Daniel's 4 beasts, we are also moving steadily westwards. So it looks something like this. The yellow part to the east is the extent, the farthest extent westwards of the Babylonian Empire. It really only stretched across to the area of modern Palestine on the coast, on the Mediterranean coast. But the Medo-Persian Empire travelled a little further westwards into the territory that biblically was known as Asia Minor, or modern Turkey, and across the Bosphorus into the region beyond, which I suppose technically is actually part of Europe. The Grecians went a little further because, of course, they embraced Macedonia and Achaia and reached even further. But it's not till we come to the 4th beast, Daniel's 4th beast, that we suddenly realize that we've come across an empire that is thoroughly European, isn't it? It's completely European. So Daniel's 4th beast is to be found living in Europe. But you see, what's interesting about that beast, as we discovered the other day, is the 4th beast, remember, continues until the time of Christ. Remember, there's no 5th beast. The 4th beast continues right down till the time of the end. So what we're being told is the theatre of operations for Bible prophecy in the latter days concerning that last beast. Where's it going to be? It's going to be in Europe, because that's where that beast lives. That's where it's always lived. That's Japhethite territory. The beast that lives for 2,000 years roams the lands of the sons of Japheth. That's where the beast lives. And in fact, of course, as we said yesterday in our studies, the fact is that although we tend to think sometimes that the book of Revelation is extremely difficult to understand, if I just put it to you this way in terms of those beasts, it's not really difficult at all, because this is what Revelation's about. There's our 4th beast of Daniel 7, and Revelation chapter 12 says, well, there's that next beast, which is simply the next stage of that 4th beast. And Revelation 13 says, here's the next stage, and again, here's the next stage, and finally, here's the last stage, and it's all simply that 4th beast down through time till Christ comes to do battle with it, because there's never a 5th beast. These are all the stages of the 4th beast. And so the Roman Empire and its central religion, the Roman Catholic Church, in its successive stages of manifestation, spans all those centuries of time from the apostles of the 1st century to our own time with modern Europe under the influence of the papacy. So we're in Europe in order for the unfolding of this particular story of the Roman beast to take place. And therefore there's a connection with the sons of Japheth and this beast in particular, because this is where the sons of Japheth live as well. Now that brings us in fact to Revelation chapter 13. If you come to Revelation chapter 13 and just looking at those beasts that are there on that particular screen, Revelation chapter 13 in fact has 2 of those beasts. It mentions, well, three aspects actually. In Revelation 13, verse 1 says, I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And that's the one described on the screen here of Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 to 10. Because do you remember what verse 2 says? It looked like a leopard. But the funny thing is that the feet were like the feet of a bear, and the mouth was as the mouth of a lion. And then we're told again, aren't we, in verse 11, I beheld another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb and spake as a dragon. And so we've got the other beast of Revelation chapter 13. And the interesting thing about Revelation 13 is that we believe that all of these symbols existed both, in a sense, sequentially, but also concurrently. There was a time when all the aspects of Revelation chapter 13 were together. A dragon, a beast of the sea, a beast of the earth, and an image of the beast. In fact, let me show you that again, just in terms of the geographic. One of the things that really surprises me, I suppose the word surprises isn't the right word. One of the things that astonishes me and thrills me is the marvelous way in which the Spirit of God was able, in the compass of one small chapter, Revelation chapter 13, is to show many centuries of what actually happened across the face of Europe in just a few verses. It's unbelievable how the Spirit was able to do that, and to capture the ebb and flow of what was going on by the nations in the whole of the European landmass. There's something absolutely brilliant about it. So let's just have a look at that, the successive stages of the Roman beast across the face of Europe. Because what this chapter, Revelation 13, talks about is a beast of the sea. And that beast of the sea, by the way, we remember answers, it's called the beast of the sea because it answers to the sea coast. And so the beast of the sea answers to both France and the Latin kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula, tracing our way all around the water's edge. It was a beast of the sea, particularly in that sense. But we've also got in this chapter the dragon of the east. And the dragon, we believe, was based in Constantinople, which is one of the reasons why we say that Russia is the dragon power designate. Russia is the dragon power designate. Not until Russia takes Constantinople does it become the dragon power at the time of the end. The final, which form of manifestation of the serpent power of sin? Religious? Political? Military. The final military stage of that manifestation of the sin power. But we've also got in this chapter a beast of the earth. And the beast of the earth actually answers to the central part of the European landmass, answering principally to the area of Germany and the surrounding area. And lastly, we've got what's called the image of the beast, which answers to the papacy based in Rome later on at the end of this particular chapter. So we've got all this taking place sometimes at the same time and sometimes separately throughout the length and breadth of Europe and throughout the history of Europe itself. Now, what's interesting about that particular slide, brothers and sisters, is this, that the beast of the sea was mainly France. But that's Gomer, isn't it? And the beast of the earth was mainly Germany, but that's Magog. So the two beasts of this chapter, remarkably, have reference to Gomer and Magog, France and Germany, and yet these are the two oldest sons of Japheth, you see. In fact, there was a whole kingdom centered in France called Neustria, and there was a whole kingdom centered in Germany called Austrasia, and these two kingdoms grew up side by side in Europe, one in France, one in Germany. So who combined the two together for the first time? And the answer was Charlemagne the Great. By the way, you might have seen, this is a digression, but interesting one, you might have seen the other day that there was a bit of a kerfuffle in the newspaper that some of Isaac Newton's papers had been dug up from an archive in Jerusalem, and one of them had the final date for the end of the world that Isaac Newton had calculated. Anyone know what the date was? 2060, absolutely right. Now, what's really interesting is, guess how he calculated the date? Because not very difficult, really. Well, Charlemagne, you see, who brought together the kingdom of Neustria and Austrasia, Germany and France, and united them into what would become, by the way, the Holy Roman Empire, he was crowned on Christmas Day, as I recall. And there's a bit of argument about the date. It's either 799 AD or 800 AD. And by the way, that empire, the Holy Roman Empire, would last for 1,000 years. Why 1,000 years? It's a rival millennium, you see. Now, if you add 1,260 years onto AD 800, you get to 2060. And that's how Isaac Newton worked his date out for the end of the world. So that's interesting, isn't it? Bears thinking about. So in terms of the story then of what Charlemagne did, let me just show you that in terms of his empire, because when he brought all that together, that's what it looked like. He bound together France and Germany into one Holy Roman Empire, and there was a collaboration between the emperor, political, and the Pope, religious, and those two powers were brought together. But I just want you to notice what happened historically to that empire as time moved on, because when Charlemagne died, his sons weren't strong enough to keep it together, and it began to separate into, in fact, individual components. So by the time we come to Frederick I in 1189, so we've moved on a bit of time, we've come from 814, the death of Charlemagne, to 1189, the death of Frederick I, and you notice which way is the Holy Roman Empire shrinking? It's shrinking eastwards out of the territory of Gomer. And when we come to the death of Maximilian, who was one of the later emperors in 1519, you'll notice now that the Holy Roman Empire has shrunk into Germany and out of France. Do you notice that? So it's separated out, as it were, back to the two old states. There was something in France and something in Germany, and never the twain shall meet. These two boys, these two sons of Japheth, you see, were always at loggerhead. First and second sons. Now, by the way, let me just show you something on that map. I want you to just notice this. See that little blue smudging of line there? That's the ancient dividing line between Gomer and Magog, answering essentially to the industrial basin area there, and as we said before, the Rhine River. And that ancient dividing line between Gomer and Magog, just tuck that away and remember that line exists. So as we said, that beast system that existed in Europe spanned over 1,000 years of history, and in fact was eventually terminated in 1806 with the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire and the abdication of the last emperor, 1806, which, by the way, was part of the work of the vile judgments of Revelation chapter 16 that we looked at yesterday. Remember how we said that the false prophet first turns up, surprisingly, in the middle of the 1800s. I wonder why that would be. Well, it's around about this time. And part of the vile judgments were actually going to reduce the power of the papacy. So the Jesuits had to think of something. So they said, well, if we're going to lose our land, let's recover the authority and prestige of the papacy in some other way. I know, we'll make him infallible. Good idea. And that's what the story's all about, you see. The papacy's always been able to transform itself into something else to escape the vicissitudes of life. And yet the strange thing is that even though that beast officially came to an end in 1806, when we come to the book of Revelation in detail, it's absolutely clear that the Bible requires a latter-day beast. Now we know that because of, well, look at these references. Revelation 14, does anyone know how Revelation 14 begins? And I saw... How does Revelation 14 begin? What's that? Yes? I looked and saw a lamb stood upon Mount... So that's Christ back in the earth, right? Christ is back in the earth. The lamb stood upon Mount Zion. And yet in the context of that time period, when Christ is back in the earth, it talks about those who have no rest night and day, who had been involved in worshipping the beast and his image. And the suggestion is that that's something that was going on at the time that Christ returns to stand upon Mount Zion. And if you're not sure about that one, Revelation 15 says, and I saw as it were a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten victory over the beast. When does the sea of glass mingled with fire occur? Well, that's the judgments of God upon the face of the earth to subdue them all under the rule of Christ. And there's a beast mentioned at that time. And what about Revelation 16, which we looked at yesterday? I saw 3 unclean spirits like frogs come out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast. But what does the very next 2 verses say of Revelation 16? Well, they're going to gather them together to the battle of Armageddon. So there's a beast at the time of Armageddon, and out of the mouth of that beast comes a spirit that gathers the nations to Armageddon. Revelation 17 says, these have one mind and shall give their strength and power to the beast, and they shall make war with the Lamb. So when the Lamb comes, there's a beast there. And finally, Revelation 19 says, and the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet, and they were both cast alive into a lake of fire, and it's the man called Faithful and True that rides out to do battle with that beast, and that man is the Lord Jesus Christ. There's got to be a beast at the time of the end, says the book of Revelation. A latter-day beast. So here is a case in point, where there are prophecies showing that the beast system was destroyed. It had its power removed. And by the way, if you read Revelation 16 carefully, you'll see that going on. And yet, clearly we've got an indication that biblically we must have a latter-day beast. Of course, it doesn't say, does it? None of those references say, is that latter-day beast the beast of the sea or the beast of the earth? Well, by the way, I think it's probably both of them. I think it's probably both of them in combination again. Which means, of course, if that's true, if it's going to be both the beast of the sea and the beast of the earth, then what two nations must be involved in the beast at the time of the end? France, beast of the sea, and Germany, beast of the earth. If it's a revival of both those beasts at the time of the end, then we expect those two nations to be intimately involved with that situation. Now, what's interesting is this, and you'll know European history no doubt as well as I, and that's this, that if we go to the face of Europe, even in modern times, what we have is a map crisscrossed with all sorts of nation states. And of course, it gets even worse if we go back 50 years, 100 years, 150 years, 200 years. It gets even more complicated. There are all sorts of little places, little sovereign states. But the interesting thing about Europe for all of that period of time is it was hopelessly divided and fragmented into lots of little nations. All the sons of Japheth squabbling over the European landmass. And by the way, in particular, if we went back 150 years, you would have found that France and Germany were at war. If you go back 100 years, you'll find that France and Germany were at war. If you go back 50 years, you'll find, well, almost 50 years, you'll find that France and Germany were at war. The two oldest sons of Japheth struggling for supremacy. And frankly, the idea of a modern beast with France and Germany cooperating together would have seemed absolutely impossible. Even a little bit more than 50 years ago. And of course, by the way, were there any leaders that tried to do that after Charlemagne? Was there anyone that tried to create that uniting of Europe that would have brought that beast back to life, as it were? Yes? Name some of them for me. Napoleon himself tried to do this. Hitler tried to do this. Bismarck tried to do this. That there were a number of European leaders that sought to recreate the empire of Charlemagne. That was their dream. An empire where the sons of Japheth would collaborate together again and form a powerful entity that would astonish the world at large. And none of them ever managed to do it. And suddenly, out of the blue, in quite the strangest way, something else happened. A new force arose to confederate Europe that wasn't military, that wasn't a leader, that wasn't going to win the unification of Europe by battle or by conquest. No, it was driven by entirely different means. See, that's part of the wisdom of how God works, you see. And in particular, I refer to in this particular case, to what was described as the Franco-German Friendship Treaty. Now, by the way, you've probably all heard of the Treaty of Rome, 1957, because that was the landmark treaty, wasn't it, that really began the European Union. Signed where, by the way? You don't know? Signed, of course, in Rome, because it was known as the Treaty of Rome. Signed in one of the great Vatican palaces. They all sat down. The Pope gave his blessing. Was it St. John Lateran's? The Lateran Palace? I rather suspect it could have been signed in the Lateran Palace. Been a very significant place, that, of course, hasn't it, down through time, the Lateran Palace. It's also where the Lateran Treaty was signed, 1929. By the way, that's another whole story, the Lateran Treaty. But we won't digress onto that now. But that's a very, very interesting story in terms of Bible prophecy. So this particular treaty you might not know so much about. This was signed in 1963, and two old men sat down to sign together. I say old, of course, with the greatest sense of respect. But President Charles de Gaulle was 73 when he signed the document, and Chancellor Konrad Adenauer was 87 when he signed the document. And these two old men signed what was called the Franco-German Friendship Treaty, and they both stood up, wept tears, and embraced one another because of the significance of what they'd done. Because what they'd done was they'd brought together Gomer and Magog into a treaty of friendship for the first time for centuries. And in that very year, the Pope issued one of his famous encyclicals, and the Pope's encyclical for the year 1963 was Pacem in Terris, which being translated from the Latin means peace on earth, because the two boys of the sons of Japheth had finally reconciled and there would be peace in Europe. Well, let me show you a little bit about that friendship treaty, because it turns out to be quite a remarkable thing. Signed on the 22nd of January 1963, which, by the way, is now called Franco-German Day, at least if you live in France or live in Germany. It's known as Franco-German Day. They celebrate that as a special holiday. Well, that particular treaty provides for the heads of state and for the government to meet together twice a year. Two state meetings, as it were, at presidential level. It also provides for the foreign ministry officials to meet together 12 times a year, which leads to 4 special meetings of the 2 foreign ministers of the country, and a Defence and Security Council meeting twice a year as well. But not only do the foreign ministers meet, so also do the defence ministers. So there are what's called the coordinators for Franco-German cooperation that meet twice a year, and the defence ministers meet 4 times a year and meet with the foreign ministers for the Defence and Security Council meetings. And there's also the joint ambassadorial conference of all French and all German ambassadors who meet together in conference. Can you imagine that? All the French and all the German ambassadors have a combined ambassadorial conference, and then there's an environment council meeting and a cultural council meeting and 1 or 2 other bits and pieces that happen. So what this treaty did is it laid the framework for what we might describe as an unprecedented level of cooperation between France and Germany. And there's been 2 amendments to that treaty since that have only made it even stronger. Of course, the real test was, well, that's all fine to put it down on paper, but how will it work at the actual level of the leaders when they come together? Because most people that become chancellors or presidents have a reasonably developed ego concerning themselves and their importance in life. What happens when you bring 2 of those people together in terms of how this might work? Well, that's been one of the most remarkable parts to this whole story as you come down through time. Because all the leaders have actually gone on very well because they all believed in the benefits of this treaty. So remember, it started with Konrad Adenauer and Charles de Gaulle, and they cooperated together for the signing of this treaty. But then there was another set of leaders, Helmut Schmidt and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. And they happened to get on extremely well, as it turned out, as time unfolded. And then there was Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand, who actually got together extremely well, considering they were quite diverse politicians, really, those 2. And then there was Gerhard Schröder and Jacques Chirac. And they were both very, very independent men, but they got on surprisingly well under the terms of this treaty. And now we've got Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, and they seem to be getting on all right under the terms of this treaty. It's almost as if they've seen that the treaty is so important that they've got to get on so that that fellowship can be strengthened. Just an illustration of how that happens. If you think about George Bush here and, meetings, how often would you expect the Prime Minister of Australia or the head of Britain to visit the President of America? How many times a year would you think? Once? Twice? 3 times? Probably once would be enough. that would be considered more than usual in terms of state visits on a regular basis. Well, remember, the treaty provides that the head of Germany and the head of France will meet together twice a year. Do you know that in the years 82 to 89, Helmut Kohl and François Mitterrand, so how many years is that? 82, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88, 8 years, they met together 80 times. The heads of state met together 80 times. That's unbelievable. And by the way, during that time, the two foreign ministers were Hans-Dietrich Genscher on Germany's side and Claude Cheysson on the French side. And during the years 1982 to 1984, those two foreign ministers had 1,000 telephone calls. It's quite a lot. This is unbelievable, the level of cooperation that actually goes on under the terms of that treaty. And in fact, although it's called the Franco-German Friendship Treaty, of course, from our perspective, looking at it biblically and the revival of the beast at the time of the end, what would we call the treaty? And the answer is, well, we'd say it's the Magog-Gomer Pact, because biblically that's what we expect, isn't it? Is that those two sons of Japheth will be in alliance at the time of the end, so that that particular organization might be seen to be revived. It's the Magog-Gomer Pact. The treaty established a requirement for Franco-German consultation on foreign policy and on security and defense issues, and that the two nations strive to reconcile their viewpoints and seek a common position. And in fact, in an extract from a Harvard paper which I've read on this particular treaty, it says, the treaty crowned a process of reconciliation and irrevocably ended the times of Franco-German hereditary enmity. Gomer and Magog have become friends at the time of the end. And single-handedly, they've created what really amounts to the revival of the beast across the face of Europe. Let me show you how remarkable that is in terms of what's going on there. There was an occasion at the United Nations where a vote needed to be taken, and for some reason, neither the German foreign minister or the German chancellor were able to be there for the United Nations vote. So guess who voted for Germany? Why, Jacques Chirac of France, who was empowered to vote on behalf of Germany. I mean, that's remarkable. The president of another country. Gomer cast his own vote and then cast Magog's as well. And in fact, if you were to go to the foreign ministry in Paris, even today, and walk through the offices of the foreign ministry in Paris, you may hear coming out of one of the rooms, "Die volbracht dein Nachtigaden in Ubeschieden?" And you think, that doesn't sound like a Frenchman. And the answer is, no, it's not. It's a German foreign ministry official who actually works inside the French foreign ministry. They swap officials. And if you went to Berlin, to the German foreign ministry department, you might walk through a door there and hear a voice saying, "Combien de chars avez-vous de votre monsieur?" And you've got French and German foreign ministry officials who sit on opposite sides in the other nation's building and look at papers relating to the other nation's affairs. That's unbelievable. Absolutely unbelievable. This is the Franco-German Friendship Treaty, and it's remarkable that it's happened in just the last 40 years or so and has changed the face of Europe in terms of what's been going on. So much so that if we were to say, well, who's really revived this beast system at the time of the end? Well, not only has it been revived by the sons of Japheth, but in particular, who's revived it? Who drives it? Where's the engine room for this whole story? It's Magog and Gomer. It's Gomer and Magog, isn't it? They're who are driving this beast system at the time of the end. The two oldest sons of Japheth. In fact, let me just show you how remarkable the developments have been in terms of the last, shall we say, 10 or 15 years of policy initiatives for the revival of the European system. In 1993, there was, of course, the Maastricht Treaty, which really advanced the cause of European Union quite substantially, because In that year, the same year as the signing of the treaty, the single European market came into existence. The abolition of border controls, the abolition of various tariffs, the abolition of the necessity to provide passports, travelling within the European Union. The European Monetary Union Agreement was signed that would pave the way for the introduction of a common currency. In fact, by the way, currency is really a key. If you all share the same money, you start to feel the same. So they decided that one of the things that was really important here was that if they could get everyone on the same money, then you'll start to feel that you belong to the European beast system. Of course, they didn't put it quite that way, but you know what I mean. In 1993, Eurocorps was established, the Rapid Response Force. I'll come back to that later on, because that was a very significant development. In 1998, the European Central Bank. The euro was launched in 1998. And in 2002, the blueprint of a European constitution, which, if finally passed, will merge all previous European treaties and provide, if the original constitution had its way, for why? A European president, a president of Europe, and for a European diplomatic corps and embassies. So what would happen if all that took place in accordance with the original provisions of the constitution? You would no longer have a German embassy here in America, or a French embassy. You'd have a European embassy representing the nation of Europe. You see, they're all friends now, these sons of Japheth. They're all getting on pretty well. And by the way, our expectation for these things isn't just driven by the book of Revelation, is it? Because if you come back to the book of Ezekiel and to Ezekiel chapter 38, which of course is a chapter we know quite well within the brotherhood, but you'll remember what Ezekiel 38 says. Ezekiel 38 says, well, it says this in terms of the system at the time of the end. Just before I take you to Ezekiel 38, let me just show you what you might describe as the key centres of the latter-day beast. I just want you to notice something here in terms of where they are. Brussels, Luxembourg, and Strasbourg. Do you notice where they are, by the way? Where are they all? Why, they're all sitting on the ancient dividing line between Gomer and Magog. Now, wasn't that clever? That's where they are. And if we were to say, well, what's going on? Actually, by the way, there's one of those that disturbs the balance, and that's that one there. But that's very significant, which I'll come back to in a minute. So Brussels is where the European Commission sits. These are the paper pushers. This is the bureaucracy team. And they generate lots of paper and lots of laws. The European Council sits there, the European Economic and Social Committee and the Committee of the Regions, all based in Brussels. But in Luxembourg, we've got the European Court of Justice, we've got the European Court of Auditors, and we've got the European Investment Bank. In Strasbourg, we've got the European Parliament itself, the European Ombudsman, and Eurocorps. And guess what we've got in Frankfurt? We've only got one thing in Frankfurt, but it's the crucial one. We've got the European Central Bank. Of course, you know the golden rule, don't you, brothers and sisters? Ever heard of the golden rule? He who has the gold rules. And when it came to where the bank would be that set the currency conditions for the European system, the Germans made sure it was sitting in Germany. And they have much more conservative fiscal policies than the French do. And the euro is driven largely by German initiatives rather than by French. That's caused a little bit of angst between the two brothers, but by and large, it's working out okay. And we've also got Europol and Eurojust and a European Constitution and a European Charter of Fundamental Rights, the possibility of a European president, a European diplomatic corps, and a European army. There's lots going on. And really, if you were to go back even 50 years, you'd be amazed when you saw all that to think how far advanced the beast system has come in the last 50 years of history. But somehow, brothers and sisters, it sits there under our very nose and it passes by and we don't notice it. But it's been a tremendous change in the face of Europe, quite startling the developments in terms of the revival of the beast system at the time of the end. So let's come to, as we said, the prophecy of Ezekiel then, and let me just draw your attention to a couple of things there in terms of what it says. Of course, you remember what it says in Ezekiel 38 and verse 1. The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog. So there's one of the sons. And amongst the company of those brought together in this confederacy, verse 6 says, Gomer and all his bands. So there they are. Magog, verse 2, and Gomer, verse 6. So those two oldest boys of the sons of Japheth are both there in this controversy at the time of the end. It's an uprising of the sons of Japheth. Ezekiel 38 is the story of the uprising of the sons of Japheth. And the leader is called Gog, and Gog was the ancient name for a mighty leader of the Scythians. And who were the Scythians? The Scythians were the Magogites, and the Magogites were Japhethites. Now, I want you to notice something interesting, just by the way is sort of like an aside. Oh, I've even got the lines right this time, the colours rather, because this is the red line. These are the nations that come against Israel at the time of the end. And there's Magog and Gomer in collaboration with Rosh and Meshech and Tubal and Togarmah and Persia and Libya and Ethiopia. Of course, you know what's interesting about all of those red line nations? There's not a single Arab amongst them. Did you notice that? Not a single Arab nation in sight in any of the red nations coming against Israel at the time of the end. That's significant, isn't it? And we've got some blue ones as well. Sheba and Dedan in collaboration with Tarshish supporting Israel. Now, what's really nice about that map, although it's up on the chart there, and you think, well, that's a modern piece of technology on Brother Lewis's PowerPoint. You know, that map's 150 years old. Because that's the same map with the same nations in the same spots that was used by Christadelphians 150 years ago to preach prophecy. And our community, our brotherhood's been using that map with those nations on that map pretty much in the same place for 150 years to give public lectures about the significance of the time of the end. But the wonderful thing is that we have seen the dramatic revival of the beast system beyond all comprehension that tells us that the final stage of God's purpose is certainly near. And I think, brothers and sisters, we're very near. We're close to the time of the end in terms of what we've seen developing there. So in fact, what might our expectations be from a biblical perspective? Well, let me show you one thing that will interest you but won't please the French. And that's this. I think when you really think about it, what the Bible indicates is that of the two sons driving that beast system, Germany is going to dominate. Now, we're told, aren't we, in this particular chapter of Ezekiel, that although Gomer, which is France, and other Japhethite nations are associated with the Gogian Confederacy, Magog is right at the start of the story. Gog of the land of Magog. Magog is right at the heart of who leads this particular confederacy and of who's involved in this controversy. And we know that that's the case because, do you remember what we found yesterday? After Gog's army is destroyed on the mountains of Israel, what does chapter 39 go on to say is going to happen? Can you remember? And the answer is that after the defeat of Gog, we're told that the judgments of God are turned upon not France, not Gomer, but upon Magog as the primary force in the war that follows in Europe. And do you remember what we discovered also in our last study yesterday when we come to the very time of the end, to the end of the millennial age, and there's a final rebellion? What's the name of the protagonists given at the end of the 1,000 years? What are they called? Why, Gog and Magog. The final revolt of the seed of the serpent power at the end of the millennium is named on the basis of the revolt that's happened in pre-millennial times. It becomes the basis for the type of the last revolt against Gog. So I think we can anticipate continued increase in Magog's influence in Europe until it becomes the dominant force in the European Union. And by the way, that's already happening. And you know when that started? It started when Germany reunified. And from the moment that Germany reunified, it's become increasingly more and more powerful in terms of influencing the state of affairs within the European system. So from a biblical perspective, therefore, I think we have the following expectations. The first is, as we've seen, the increasing dominance of Magog until it becomes the driving force behind the European Union. Now, we might just turn, in terms of this, to Revelation chapter 17. Because there's a couple of things we're going to mention out of that chapter in terms of just two or three of these points that will be noted on the screen. So in addition to the dominance of Magog in that European Union, I think we also expect to see the influence of Roman Catholicism in Magog, or alternatively, great progress towards a Roman Catholic Lutheran reconciliation in Germany. And there's a reason why we say that from a biblical perspective, which I'll put up the quotations for in just a minute. I think we also expect to see the increasing economic prosperity of the European Union that will establish a strong global position. I'm not asking you to buy stocks and bonds tomorrow on the basis of that prophetical prognostication, but the reality is we expect the European system to show some measure of economic prosperity immediately prior to the crisis that will defeat it in Revelation chapter 17. I think we expect to see the increasing momentum of the European Union towards establishing a separate political entity distinct from the individual nations that it represents. And lastly, I think we are going to see the increasing likelihood of the member states to seek the militarization of the European Union rather than the development of their national forces. Now, I just want to look at the last two by means of a quotation in Revelation chapter 17. So let me give you the passages first. There they are. And now let's have a look at Revelation chapter 17 and verses 12 to 14. It says, "And the 10 horns which thou sawest are 10 kings, which have received no kingdom as yet, but receive power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind, and shall give their power and strength unto the beast." Now that's interesting, brothers and sisters. They will give their power, the 10 horns, the 10 individual nations, will give their power and their strength unto the beast. Now, you see that word power there? It's the word dunamis. And dunamis means, literally, force. And I think it's being used here as a synonym for military might. They will give their dunamis, their force, unto the beast. And then it says that they'll also give their strength unto the beast. And the word strength is the word exousia in the Greek, which means authority. They'll give their force, their dunamis, their military control to the beast, and they'll give their exousia, their authority, what do you think that would be? Political control to the beast. Now just stop and think about how remarkable that verse is, brothers and sisters. I think what that's telling us at the time of the end is that the individual members are going to relinquish their military and political authority into the hands of the system itself. And I think that's exactly what our expectation is. And that's exactly what's happening in Europe right now, is that if they were able to create a European Union with a European president at the head, and by the way, one of the European Parliament members is of course Otto van Habsburg, one of the dynasty of the Habsburgs, and he has long argued that Europe really needs a European president, and that once that president's selected, he should be president for life. Oh, and Otto van Habsburg also believes that the president should be crowned with a particular crown he should wear as the symbol of his presidential authority. You'd never guess what crown he recommends that the president of Europe should wear. Why, the crown of Charlemagne, of course, which they've still got. See, it's like a whole system. It's like the beast is revived and there is political power given to the beast. There's a president that sits at the top of the pile and in fact is the final authority politically in Europe at the time of the end. Don't be surprised, brothers and sisters, if you see developments heading in that direction, because the prophecy requires that they will give their authority to the beast. Now, what about the military side? Well, that's one of the most remarkable stories of all. Go back 50 years, and what was the great military power based in Europe? The answer is NATO, the NATO forces. And the idea of Europe having an army, well, you just didn't even talk about that. That was off the record. In fact, I've been to Germany, and one of the brothers and sisters that we've stayed with, who are now related to us, in Kornwestheim, right there in Kornwestheim, in their little village, is where one of the American bases was. It's all empty, it's all gone. All those forces have been removed. And you remember that what happened in 1993, at the time of the Treaty of Maastricht, is they said, well, let's create what's called a European Rapid Response Force. Just a little group, mind you, nothing large, nothing too worrying, just a little wee group in case there was an emergency. We need to have a little team of battle-hardened personnel that can be whizzed to wherever in case a little problem emerges. Oh no, they had much bigger ideals than that. That Rapid Response Force is growing and growing and growing. And Angela Merkel has said quite openly that she wants a European army. One of the problems, of course, with the European system is that every nation's got their own communication systems and their own technology, and it's all a complete disaster at the moment in terms of European cooperation. And I think the time is going to come where they're going to say, this is hopeless. We need to centralize all of this into one chain of command, one set of technologies. Let's make a European army, shall we? And Bible prophecy will be fulfilled. They will give their strength, political, their power, military, and their strength to the beast. And by the way, that's another interesting thing, is that if that was true, what the beast system would stand for at the time of the end is a political leader, one man. So what you'd then have is one man as the leader of the military serpent power, whose name is Gog, and one man who would be the leader of the political power, the president of the beast, and one man who's the leader of the religious power, the papacy in Rome. And so you'd have a champion for each of those sections of the seed of the serpent power at the time of the end. But of course, when that story began in Genesis, all of those three offices were held in one man, whose name was Nimrod. He says, I'm the military chief, I'm the political chief, and I'm the religious leader. And at the time of the end, we expect, I think, that Brother Thomas always said, we expect to see an emperor in Europe at the time of the end. I'm not sure that he's wrong, brothers and sisters. I think it's quite possible that there will be some political development that will lead to that appointment in Europe, and Revelation chapter 17 and verse 13 will be fulfilled. Quite remarkable. So we're living in it, brothers and sisters. We're living in the fulfillment of prophecy, I believe, right now before our very eyes. And you notice what it says in the very next verse of Revelation 17. Verse 13 again. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. And these shall make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb shall overcome them. For he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And remember what we said yesterday? And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. It's not just the Lamb, it's those that are with him. The called and the chosen and the faithful ones. And that whole beast system at the time of the end is destined to make war with the Lamb and with the saints. And one thing, brothers and sisters, which I think we can be quite confident about, is that when the Lamb comes and does battle with the beast, Christadelphians won't be discussing who the monster might be. Well, I wonder whether the beast is this. Or I wonder whether the beast is that. Those who are associated with the Lamb ought to know who the beast is, don't you think? If we're going to do battle with it when the Lamb comes. So we need to be clear on our prophetical expectations and aware that when the Lamb comes, that whole system that's been so marvelously revived in Europe at the time of the end is all going to be done away with, because the Lamb shall overcome them. And they that are with him are called and chosen and faithful. Well, pray God, brothers and sisters, that we might be among those with the Lamb in that day.